Let me ask you something uncomfortable. Why is it that every time you feel angry, you swear it's because someone else made you that way? Your boss triggered you, your partner pushed your buttons, traffic ruined your mood. Funny how your emotions always seem to have a villain. And it's never you. You slam doors, send reckless texts, ruin relationships, and then shrug like, that's just how I felt. No, that's just how you excused yourself. Because believing your emotions are uncontrollable reflexes is convenient. It lets you stay reckless and innocent at the same time. And here's the problem. That belief is scientifically wrong, not kind of wrong, not philosophically debatable, flat out, data destroyed, ego threatening wrong, which means most people aren't emotionally immature because they're broken. They're immature because they're operating on a lie that feels comforting, and today we're tearing that lie apart. This video is based on the book How Emotions Are Made: The Secret Life of the Brain by Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. Before you roll your eyes and think, great, another pop psychology book, slow down. Barrett isn't a motivational speaker. She isn't selling affirmations. She's a neuroscientist, a psychology professor at Northeastern University, and one of the most cited emotion researchers alive. She spent decades studying the brain, not guessing, not philosophizing, measuring it. And what she discovered pissed off an entire field, because for over 2,000 years, humans believed something very simple about emotions, that emotions are hardwired, universal, biological reactions. Fear is fear, anger is anger, sadness is sadness, and when they show up, you just deal with them. Your brain triggers them, your face reveals them, your body expresses them. Sounds obvious, right? It's also wrong. And Barrett doesn't just challenge this idea, she demolishes it with neuroscience, biology, and cultural evidence. Her core claim is unsettling. You don't discover emotions, you construct them, which means your anger isn't automatic, your anxiety isn't inevitable, your sadness isn't a reflex. They're predictions your brain makes based on past experience, language, culture, and context. Translation? If you've been saying, that's just how I am emotionally, this book says, no, that's just how you were trained. And that realization is either empowering or deeply offensive. Disclaimer, before we go any further, this video is not a replacement for the book. It falls under fair use for educational and commentary purposes. We're analyzing, transforming, and adding critical insight, not reproducing the text. If anything here hits a nerve, buy the book. Because the real damage happens when you actually read the evidence. Welcome to Mindful Reads Hub. Let's get started. The biggest lie we've ever believed about emotion. For more than 2,000 years, humans have told themselves the same comforting story about emotions. That anger hijacks you, that fear floods your system, that sadness descends like weather, and that once it happens, you're basically a passenger. This idea didn't come from neuroscience, it came from philosophy, from ancient thinkers who didn't have brain scanners, hormone assays, or even a working understanding of biology. They had metaphors, the mind as a battlefield, reason as the rider, emotion as the horse, and somehow we never updated the story. Fast forward to the modern world and you still hear it everywhere. In therapy offices, in courtrooms, in corporate leadership trainings, in viral TikToks explaining why you snapped. The language has changed, but the belief hasn't. Emotions are treated like internal reflexes that fire automatically, universally, and identically across humans. Except when scientists actually went looking for proof, the entire thing fell apart. For decades, researchers across continents tried to find what they called emotional fingerprints. The idea was simple. If emotions are hardwired biological programs, then anger should look like anger everywhere. Same facial muscles, same heart rate patterns, same brain regions lighting up. Fear should be fear whether you're in New York, Nairobi, or New Delhi. So they measured faces, they measured bodies, they measured brains, and what they found wasn't clarity, it was chaos. The same emotion produced wildly different physiological patterns. Heart rates went up, down, or stayed the same. Faces didn't cooperate. People smiled when they were stressed, scowled when they were focused, cried when they were furious. Even the amygdala, long sold as the fear center, activated during novelty, uncertainty, learning, and sometimes not at all during fear. This wasn't a few failed experiments. Meta-analyses spanning tens of thousands of participants showed the same thing over and over. There is no consistent biological signature for any single emotion. No universal anger, no universal fear, no universal sadness, which creates a problem nobody wanted to deal with. Because if emotions don't have fingerprints, then the entire foundation of how we talk about emotional responsibility collapses. The legal system assumes rage overrides reason. Medicine assumes anxiety has a specific bodily profile. Education assumes kids need to identify emotions on faces as if those faces mean the same thing to everyone. But faces don't speak for themselves. Context does the talking. A raised voice can be grief at a funeral, celebration at a football match, or survival during a protest. A wide-eyed stare can be fear, curiosity, aggression, or exhaustion. Even infants, who are supposed to be pure, untrained emotional truth machines, don't express emotions in clean, adult-like categories. Adults project meaning onto them based on situation, culture, and expectation, which tells you something deeply uncomfortable. We don't recognize emotions, we interpret them, and interpretation is not biology, it's learning. Look around the world, and this becomes impossible to ignore. In some cultures, emotional restraint signals respect. In others, expressiveness signals honesty. In some languages, there are words for emotional states that don't even exist in English. Feelings that blend longing, obligation, nostalgia, and moral weight into a single experience. Meanwhile, English speakers argue endlessly about whether they're anxious, depressed, burned out, or just tired. Same nervous systems, different emotional realities. And here's where the book stops being academic and starts becoming dangerous, in a good way. If emotions were universal reflexes, then your outbursts are inevitable. Your anxiety is unavoidable. Your patterns are permanent. But if they aren't, if emotions are not biological facts but mental constructions, then most people aren't emotionally broken. They're emotionally trained. Trained by parents who named some feelings and ignored others. Trained by economies that reward stress and punish rest. Trained by cultures that romanticize suffering but mock regulation. Right now, in the middle of economic instability, rising living costs, mass layoffs, and constant crisis headlines, people are calling it an anxiety epidemic. But anxiety isn't spreading like a virus. Interpretations are, when uncertainty rises, brains work harder to predict a danger. When systems feel unstable, sensations get labeled as threat. That doesn't make people weak, it makes them human, operating under outdated emotional myths. And the most damaging myth of all is this, that emotions reveal truth. They don't. They reveal predictions. Your anger doesn't mean someone wronged you. Your fear doesn't mean danger is present. Your sadness doesn't mean loss is permanent. They mean your brain made its best guess based on past data, under pressure, which is terrifying and liberating. Because if this ancient story about emotions is wrong and the evidence says it is, then emotional intelligence isn't about controlling a wild inner animal, it's about updating the model. And most people would rather stay comfortable than correct. That's why this idea has been resisted for decades, not because it's weak, but because it takes away moral shortcuts. It forces accountability. It removes the excuse of, that's just how emotions work. They don't. They never did. Key idea. Emotions are not universal, hardwired biological reflexes. The scientific search for emotional fingerprints failed because emotions are not fixed entities in the body or brain. Key takeaway: if emotions don't have biological fingerprints, then how you feel is not inevitable. It's constructed, interpreted, and therefore changeable. Favorite quote: your emotions are not reactions to the world. They are your brain's predictions of what the world means. Your emotions aren't built in, they're built. Once the idea that emotions aren't universal reflexes sinks in, something even more disturbing follows. Because if emotions don't automatically fire inside you, then the obvious next question becomes, so where the hell did they come from? Most people assume the brain reacts to the world like a camera. Something happens, information goes in, emotion comes out, simple input-output machine, stimulus, response, done. That model feels intuitive. It's also backwards. Your brain is not reacting to reality, it's guessing it. Every second, your brain is running a prediction engine, not about abstract ideas, but about survival. How much energy you'll need, whether your heart rate should go up or down, whether the sensation in your chest means excitement, danger, hunger, or absolutely nothing. And it does this before you're aware of anything. This is where the book quietly humiliates common sense, because the brain doesn't wait for the world to tell it what's happening. It predicts what's about to happen and then checks reality afterward. Vision, sound, touch, they're not raw inputs, they're corrections. Reality is feedback, not instruction, which means when you feel anger, your brain didn't detect anger in the world. It constructed a meaning for bodily sensations based on past experience, fast heartbeat, tense muscles, shallow breath. Those sensations are not emotions, they're just data. Your brain takes that data and asks, what has this meant before? If you grew up in chaos, your brain learned one answer. If you grew up in stability, it learned another. If you live in an economy where prices rise faster than wages and uncertainty is constant, your brain predicts threat more often, not because you're weak, but because it's efficient. Look at what's happening globally right now. Inflation anxiety, job insecurity, housing crises across Europe, North America, parts of Asia. People describe themselves as burned out, overwhelmed, anxious. But what's actually happening is constant physiological strain being categorized as emotional danger. The body sends signals, the brain supplies meaning, and the brain always chooses the explanation that worked last time. That's the part nobody wants to hear. Your emotions feel immediate because the brain hides the construction process from you. You experience the final product, not the assembly line, which makes emotions feel inevitable, even when they're learned. This also explains why two people can experience the same event and feel completely different things. One person sees criticism as an attack, another sees it as information. Same words, same tone, different emotional reality. Because the difference isn't the event, it's the prediction. The book makes a brutal point here. The brain's primary job is not happiness, truth, or meaning. It's energy regulation, keeping you alive with the least possible cost. Emotions are tools in that process. They prepare your body for action based on what the brain thinks is about to happen next. That's why fear sharpens focus. That's why anger mobilizes energy. That's why sadness slows you down. They're not moral states, they're metabolic strategies. And this demolishes another comforting illusion that emotions reveal who you really are. They don't. They reveal what your brain expects. This matters because people confuse emotional intensity with authenticity. They think feeling something strongly makes it true, but intensity just means the brain is confident in its prediction, often because it's repeated it for years without challenge. That's how trauma loops form. That's how generational patterns survive. That's how entire cultures normalize stress and call it ambition. You see it in workplaces worldwide. Long hours, constant urgency, zero recovery. body strained, hearts racing, sleep wrecked. Then people label it passion, drive, or pressure, instead of recognizing a system training brains to predict threat as normal. The book doesn't say emotions are fake. It says they're constructed in context, real experiences, built from real sensations, shaped by history, culture, and prediction, which means the most dangerous lie isn't emotions are uncontrollable. It's this is just how I feel. Because if emotions are built, then they can be built differently. Not by pretending, not by affirmations, but by changing the predictions your brain keeps recycling. And that's the line most people don't cross, because it requires effort, uncertainty, and responsibility. Key idea: emotions are actively constructed by the brain through prediction, using bodily sensations and past experience to assign meaning in real time. Key takeaway: you don't feel emotions because the world causes them. You feel them because your brain predicts them, and predictions can be updated. Favorite quote: your brain is not reacting to the world, it is predicting it. Words don't describe emotions, they create them. Once you accept that the brain predicts and constructs emotions, the next illusion collapses fast. The idea that emotions exist independently of language. Most people think words come after feelings, like labels slapped onto something raw and primal, as if anger arrives first and language politely names it afterward. That's backwards. Without concepts, there is no emotion, only sensation. Your body is constantly producing signals: tight chest, warm face, shallow breath, heavy limbs. On their own, those signals mean nothing, they're just noise. The brain turns noise into meaning by categorizing it, and the categories come from language, culture, and shared agreement. This is where people get uncomfortable, because it means emotions are not private, sacred truths bubbling up from the soul. They're socially taught interpretations, learned, reinforced, inherited. Children don't naturally know what anxiety is, or guilt, or burnout. They learn these categories from parents, teachers, media, and peers. The brain absorbs the concepts available to it and uses them to carve up experience. If your culture has a word for a feeling, your brain can build it. If it doesn't, you experience something else entirely, or nothing at all. Anthropologists have been pointing this out for decades. Some cultures have emotions that English speakers can barely comprehend, feelings tied to communal obligation, spiritual imbalance, or seasonal change. Meanwhile, modern societies with endless psychological vocabulary have people endlessly scanning themselves for what they're feeling, turning every sensation into a potential diagnosis. Look at what's happening right now. Rising living costs, job insecurity, constant headlines about markets wobbling and systems straining. People feel a racing heart and call it anxiety, a sense of heaviness and call it depression, a lack of motivation and call it burnout. Those words don't just describe the experience, they shape it. Once a sensation is categorized, the brain commits to the story. That's why two people in the same economic conditions can feel completely different emotional realities. One feels threatened, another feels challenged. Same bodily strain, different concept. The book makes this brutally clear. Concepts are tools, they're not neutral. They guide attention, shape memory, and determine action. When you give a sensation a name, you're not reporting on reality, you're constructing it. This also explains why emotions change over time, not because human biology evolved overnight, but because language did. People today feel things their grandparents never named, not because the feelings are new, but because the concepts are. And this destroys the fantasy that emotional self-knowledge comes from looking inward. Introspection without concepts is useless. The brain doesn't discover emotions by peering inside. It builds them using the mental vocabulary it already has, which raises an uncomfortable question. If your emotional life depends on the concepts you've learned, who taught you yours? Your parents, your culture, social media, therapy language stripped of context. Because once a concept is installed, the brain uses it automatically. That's why people can feel offended before they think, or inadequate without evidence, or unsafe in objectively safe situations. The concept is ready, the brain applies it, and here's the confrontation most people avoid. Expanding your emotional vocabulary doesn't automatically make you healthier. Sometimes it makes you more fragile. More labels mean more ways to suffer, unless those concepts are grounded, flexible, and contextual. The goal isn't to eliminate emotion words, it's to use them deliberately, to recognize that language doesn't reveal emotional truth, it creates emotional possibility, which means if you want different emotional outcomes, you don't start with feelings, you start with concepts. That's not poetic, that's neurological. Key idea: language and concepts don't merely describe emotions, they are essential ingredients the brain uses to create them. Key takeaway: change the concepts you use to interpret sensations, and you change the emotions your brain is capable of constructing. Favorite quote: without concepts, the brain has no way to make meaning of sensation. The illusion of emotional universality. Once language enters the picture, people still cling to one last comforting belief, that even if emotions are shaped by culture and prediction, at least we can see them, that faces don't lie, that bodies reveal the truth, that a scowl is anger, a smile is happiness, a snarl is aggression. That belief collapses faster than the others. For decades, psychology textbooks taught that facial expressions are universal emotional signals. Show someone a picture of a face and they'll know exactly what emotion it represents. Anger looks like this. Fear looks like that. Happiness has a formula. The world ran with it. Police training, airport security, courtroom testimony, corporate leadership programs, all built on the assumption that emotion leaks out of the body whether you want it to or not. Except when scientists actually tested this idea outside tightly controlled labs, it failed repeatedly. People across different cultures do not agree on what the same facial expression means. A wide-eyed stare might signal fear in one place, respect in another, or confusion somewhere else. A raised voice might be read as anger in one context and passion in another. Even within the same culture, agreement drops the moment context is removed. Faces don't carry emotion, observers project it. This becomes obvious when you stop treating expressions like emojis and start treating them like movements. A furrowed brow can mean concentration, a clenched jaw can mean effort, tears can mean relief, joy, frustration, or exhaustion. The brain fills in the emotional story based on situation, expectation, and prior belief, which explains why people are so confident and so wrong when judging others. It also explains why technologies that claim to read emotions are fundamentally flawed. Algorithms trained on biased datasets assume universality that doesn't exist. Governments and corporations have flirted with these tools anyway, in hiring, surveillance, even border control, because the fantasy of objective emotion detection is intoxicating, but it's pseudoscience with a clean interface. The book uses animals to drive the point home. When a dog growls, people instantly say it's angry, but the growl itself isn't anger, it's a sound. The meaning depends on context, play, fear, protection, pain. Humans do the same thing to each other, mistaking behavior for internal truth. This misinterpretation has consequences. In courts, juries read remorse or guilt from facial behavior, despite no reliable link. In medicine, doctors infer emotional states from expressions and misunderlying conditions. Globally, cultural misunderstandings escalate conflict because one group reads threat where another intends respect. And this gets worse in high-stress environments. Economic instability, political unrest, social polarization. When uncertainty rises, brains default to threat-based interpretations. Neutral behavior starts looking hostile. Silence feels suspicious. Emotion becomes projection amplified by fear. The lie of universality doesn't just distort understanding, it fuels division. The book's point is ruthless. Emotion perception is an act of construction, not detection. You are not seeing someone's inner state. You are guessing, using your own concepts, biases, and expectations, which means emotional certainty about others says more about you than them. That's the confrontation most people resist, because it strips away the moral high ground of "I could tell how they felt." No, you inferred it, and you might be wrong. Once you accept that, something changes. Emotional humility replaces emotional arrogance. You ask instead of assume. You contextualize instead of label. You stop pretending that expressions are evidence, and that shift matters in a world already overloaded with misinterpretation. Key idea: emotions cannot be reliably read from faces, bodies, or behavior because emotional meaning is constructed by the observer, not revealed by the signal. Key takeaway: when you assume you can see what someone feels, you're usually projecting your own concepts, not uncovering emotional truth. Favorite quote: "A facial movement is just a movement. Emotion is the meaning we assign to it." If you build emotions, you can rebuild them. At some point, the theory stops being interesting and starts being inconvenient, because once you accept that emotions are constructed, the obvious follow-up isn't philosophical, it's practical. If emotions are built, then they're not fixed. And if they're not fixed, then most people aren't stuck. They're just repeating patterns they never questioned. This is where the book quietly turns from explanation to responsibility. Most people think emotional mastery means suppression. Bite your tongue, count to 10, calm down. That advice has survived centuries because it sounds mature. It's also mostly useless. You can't suppress what's already been assembled. By the time you feel anger in your chest or panic in your throat, the brain has already made its call. The work happens upstream. The brain builds emotions to manage energy and pursue goals. If it predicts you're under threat, it prepares you to fight or flee. If it predicts loss, it slows you down. If it predicts reward, it mobilizes effort. Emotions aren't moral judgments, they're biological investments. So when people say, "I just can't control how I feel," what they're really saying is, "I don't control the conditions my brain uses to make predictions." Sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, chronic stress, financial uncertainty, social isolation, digital overload. These aren't lifestyle details, they're inputs. A brain running on empty doesn't produce wisdom, it produces shortcuts. Look globally right now. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, people are operating under prolonged uncertainty. Inflation squeezes households. Jobs feel fragile. Futures feel unclear. And then everyone wonders why irritability, anxiety, and emotional volatility are rising. That's not weakness. That's physics. A brain conserving energy narrows its emotional range. It defaults to familiar categories. It reacts faster and thinks less. And if you don't change the inputs, no amount of positive thinking will fix the output. This is where the book's idea of emotional construction becomes empowering instead of threatening, because it reframes regulation not as force but as design. Want fewer emotional blow-ups? Improve predictability? Want less anxiety? Expand categories so sensations don't automatically mean danger. Want resilience? Reduce chronic strain so the brain doesn't live in survival mode. This also explains why emotional change feels slow. You're not flipping a switch, you're retraining a prediction system that's been reinforced for years. The brain doesn't care about insight, it cares about what works, and it only updates models when new patterns prove reliable over time. That's why emotional growth feels boring. repetitive, unsexy. No cinematic breakthroughs, just small consistent shifts in how sensations are interpreted. And this is where most people quit. They want emotional transformation without environmental change, emotional intelligence without effort, regulation without discomfort. But the brain doesn't respond to slogans, it responds to evidence. Change the evidence and it changes the prediction. This isn't about becoming emotionally neutral or spiritually detached. It's about becoming emotionally literate, knowing that a racing heart doesn't automatically mean panic. That tension doesn't always mean threat. That discomfort doesn't always mean something is wrong. And that skill matters more than ever in the world that profits from emotional reactivity. Key idea: emotional mastery comes from changing how emotions are constructed before they form by altering predictions, concepts, goals, and physical conditions. Key takeaway: you don't regulate emotions by suppressing them. You regulate them by redesigning the systems your brain uses to build them. Favorite quote: emotion regulation is not about controlling feelings, it's about influencing how they are made. When feelings become facts. Once emotional construction leaves the realm of self-help and enters institutions, the damage stops being subtle, it becomes measurable, bodies misdiagnosed, lives misjudged, systems quietly built on assumptions that were never true in the first place. Medicine is a clean example. For generations, doctors were trained to separate mind and body as if they were independent systems. Pain was physical, emotion was psychological. Treat them differently. Except real bodies don't cooperate with that fantasy. Chest pain can be cardiac, or it can be grief, or it can be fear, or it can be exhaustion, and the body does not label it for you. The brain does. This is why people, especially women and marginalized groups worldwide, get dismissed when they report symptoms that don't fit clean categories. Their sensations don't match the expected emotional narrative, so the system assumes exaggeration, anxiety, or stress. Meanwhile, serious conditions go untreated because clinicians mistake constructed emotional meaning for biological fact. The book points out something deeply uncomfortable here. Emotions influence physiology, not metaphorically, but mechanically. The brain's predictions regulate hormones, immune responses, inflammation. If the brain categorizes sensations as threat repeatedly, the body pays for it over time. Chronic stress doesn't just feel bad, it restructures health outcomes. And then there's the legal system. Courts all over the world rely on emotional assumptions they pretend are objective. Judges assess remorse by facial expression. Juries interpret guilt through tone and posture. Witness credibility gets tangled up with whether someone looks emotional enough or too emotional. Entire verdicts hinge on whether someone performed the right emotion in the right way. That's not justice, that's theater. The science is clear. Emotional expression varies wildly by culture, context, and individual history. A calm demeanor can mean control or dissociation. Tears can mean manipulation or relief. Yet institutions keep pretending emotions are transparent windows into truth. Even responsibility gets warped by this misunderstanding. Anger is treated as mitigating in some cases and condemning in others. Fear excuses behavior until it doesn't. Emotional states become legal facts when they're actually interpretations layered onto sensation and behavior. Globally, this misunderstanding fuels policy failures too. Public health messaging assumes fear motivates compliance. Shame is used to enforce norms. Outrage becomes a political tool, and when people don't respond as expected, leaders call it irrational, instead of recognizing that emotional meaning isn't universal. The book isn't arguing that emotions don't matter in these systems. It's arguing the opposite. Emotions matter so much that misunderstanding them is dangerous. If institutions treat emotions as reflexes instead of constructions, they misread behavior, misallocate resources, and reinforce inequality. They punish some people for emotional expressions they were taught and excuse others for expressions that match cultural expectations. And here's the confrontation nobody wants to make explicit. Emotional responsibility doesn't disappear just because emotions are constructed. It becomes more precise. You're not responsible for having sensations. You are responsible for the systems that keep turning those sensations into the same meanings over and over again, personally and collectively. Institutions don't get a pass either. If systems keep producing emotional harm, calling it human nature is laziness. No, science doesn't back it up. Key idea. Treating emotions as biological facts rather than mental constructions leads to misdiagnosis, injustice, and systemic failure. Key takeaway. When institutions misunderstand emotion, the consequences aren't philosophical, they're legal, medical, and human. Favorite quote, emotions are not forces that act on us, they are meanings we create. From brain to mind. Once emotions stop being treated as reflexes and start being understood as constructions, the conversation stops being about feelings and starts being about identity. Because if your brain is actively building your emotional world, then the version of you that feels stable, consistent, and obvious isn't a fixed entity either. It's an ongoing process. That's the part most people resist. We like to believe there's a core self inside us, a thinker who has emotions, a rational mind occasionally interrupted by feelings, but the neuroscience doesn't support that hierarchy. The brain doesn't separate thinking from feeling. It predicts, categorizes, regulates, and constructs experience all at once. Cognition and emotion are not rivals. They're collaborators, which means the mind isn't a passive observer of reality. It's an active participant in creating it. This reframes consciousness in a way that's deeply uncomfortable for people who want certainty. If emotions are constructed, then the mind isn't discovering truth, it's negotiating meaning. Identity becomes less about who you are and more about what your brain has learned to expect. That doesn't mean free will disappears. It means it shows up earlier than people think. Choice doesn't live at the moment of reaction. It lives in what you expose yourself to repeatedly, what environments you tolerate, what concepts you reinforce, what predictions you allow to become default. The brain becomes what it practices. This matters globally, especially in a world where narratives are constantly injected into people's minds: economic fear, cultural outrage, identity threat. When people are told repeatedly who they should be afraid of, who they are supposed to be, and what emotions are appropriate, brains adapt. Not ideologically, biologically. Look at societies under prolonged stress, political instability, conflict, economic collapse. Emotional patterns shift across generations. Hypervigilance becomes normal. Distrust becomes default. Emotional numbness becomes adaptive. And then people call it culture without acknowledging the brain's role in survival. The book's final move is subtle but radical. It dissolves the boundary between brain and mind. There is no separate mental theater where feelings appear fully formed. The mind is what the brain does when it predicts, regulates, and makes meaning. That's not reductionist, it's clarifying. And it doesn't strip life of meaning, it gives you leverage over it. If who you are is shaped by the predictions your brain makes, then growth isn't about finding your true self. It's about expanding the range of selves you can construct. More interpretations, more flexibility, more emotional options. That's why rigid identities feel safe but shrink experience, and why curiosity feels threatening but expands it. This isn't motivational, it's a warning. Because the same machinery that allows growth also allows manipulation. Whoever controls the concepts, narratives, and environments controls emotional reality. That's true for individuals, institutions, and entire populations. Understanding how emotions are made isn't about becoming calm or enlightened. It's about becoming aware enough not to be owned by invisible processes you never agreed to. And that's where responsibility finally lands, not in suppressing emotion, not in blaming biology, but in recognizing that being human is an active construction project, whether you participate or not. Most people don't participate. They inherit a mind and call it destiny. Key idea: the mind is not separate from the brain. Emotions, thoughts, and identity emerge from the brain's ongoing process of prediction and meaning making. Key takeaway: you are not a fixed emotional self. You are a continually constructed process, and awareness gives you influence over what gets built next. Favorite quote: the mind is not something you have, it is something your brain does. Conclusion: what this entire book has been doing, quietly, relentlessly, is taking away the emotional excuses we've been hiding behind for centuries. Not by shaming you, not by motivating you, but by pulling the rug out from under the story you've been telling yourself about what emotions are. Because once you understand that emotions are not hardwired reactions, not universal signals, not little biological monsters hijacking your rational brain, something uncomfortable happens. You lose the luxury of pretending you're powerless. Across all of this, one truth keeps resurfacing. Your brain is not reacting to reality, it is predicting it, constantly, automatically, economically. It guesses what's about to happen, what it means, and what you should feel, based on past experience, language, culture, and context. And then it calls that guess reality. That's why two people can live through the same recession, the same breakup, the same political chaos, the same news cycle, and feel completely different worlds collapsing around them. That's why outrage spreads faster than facts. That's why fear sells better than clarity. That's why identity feels solid, even when it's constructed on sand. And that's why most people feel stuck. Not because life is harder than before, history laughs at that, but because their emotional categories are outdated, inherited, and never questioned. The brain builds emotions the same way it builds habits, efficiently, not wisely. So when you say, that's just who I am, what you're really saying is, this is what my brain has learned to expect. And expectations can be changed. That's the part no one tells you, because it removes a massive market built on helplessness. If emotions are constructed, then mastery doesn't come from control, suppression, or positive thinking. It comes from expanding the concepts you use to interpret your body and the world. It comes from choosing better inputs, richer language, broader context, and environments that don't constantly train your brain to see threats everywhere. This isn't self-help. This is self-responsibility. It also explains why systems fail, why medicine misreads pain, why courts misinterpret intent, why leaders weaponize emotion, why entire societies can be emotionally manipulated at scale. When feelings are treated as facts instead of constructions, people stop asking how meaning is being manufactured. And that's dangerous, because whoever shapes emotional narratives shapes behavior. Markets, politics, media, culture, none of them work without emotional construction. The brain doesn't just make feelings, it makes reality livable. So here's the uncomfortable ending. You are not discovering who you are. You are participating in who you become, whether consciously or not. If you walk away with anything, let it be this. Emotional freedom is not about feeling better. It's about seeing clearer, about realizing that the mind is not a fragile thing being acted upon, but a dynamic system constantly under construction. And if that idea makes you uneasy, good, it should. Growth starts where emotional certainty dies. If this shook something loose, don't stop here. Buy the book, read it slowly, let it mess with you properly, because this isn't content, it's a recalibration. And once you see how emotions are made, you don't get to unsee it. That's the point.